I will speak about, well, the title is As Any Orator. I want a rather impressive title, but it's generally about Lincoln's rhetoric and then the relationship to Euclid's geometry, but also about the Gettysburg Address, of course, but due to the time, I would ask a bit more time for this talk. I will not say so much about the Gettysburg Address, but we'll conclude with it. We're talking about Abraham Lincoln. To Americans, of course, he needs no introduction, but for the Greeks, our Greek friends here, let me just say, you all know who he is. Of course, a few things about him, some know more. He was the 16th president of the United States, born in 1809 in a building that looked somewhat like this. Maybe it was this. This is an artist's rendition of it. And he was the son of in Kentucky, of a poor farmer and laborer. And though he is perhaps the most famous and maybe the greatest of all American presidents, he is something of a mystery. Now, how can a man about whom about 15,000 books and studies have been written be a mystery? Well, he is in the sense of his background related to his achievement. Lincoln had no official schooling, actually only, as he himself declared, only 1 year of school at some point in his life, never went to university, obviously, and all his education he owes to his reading and perhaps some of his background. This is a picture from a wonderful old film, The Young Mr. Lincoln, and we see here a young Henry Fonda as Lincoln, as a laborer when he went to Springfield, Illinois, left his father's home, and spent all his time not working. He worked on riverboats and then started a small grocery, which didn't go well with friends. He spent all his time reading voraciously, as his friends said, anything he could find. He obviously had a civic spirit. At age 23, he ran for the state Senate of Illinois, not the National Senate. He lost the first time, won the second, so at 25 he was also a state senator of Illinois. And after that, interestingly, after that, he started to work as a clerk in a lawyer's firm and became a lawyer, same film. At that time, you did not have to go to university to be a lawyer. You just had to take the exams, the state bar exams, which he took after his apprenticeship. Now, the interesting thing about Lincoln is that if he had died age 44 in 1853, that is 7 years before he became the President of the United States, he would have been, in his lifetime already, a successful lawyer in the state of Illinois, 5 times elected to the state Senate, 1 time elected to the National Senate, a very unremarkable term. I don't think we'd probably know anything about it if the rest had not followed. After which, in 1850, 10 years before he was elected president, he abandoned politics, as he thought at the time, for good, to devote himself to his law practice. And we can be more or less certain that no book published in or after his lifetime, especially not in the last 2 centuries, would contain a mention of his name. But if he had died in 1858, that is 2 years before being elected president, he would have earned pages, chapters, many whole books, especially maybe in the late 20th and early 21st century, books on the ideological battle against slavery in the 1850s. Perhaps a whole book, or if he was lucky, some PhD thesis as well. This would be because of 3 highly publicized in the state of Illinois speeches, and especially the even more highly publicized part in a debate against a new pro-slavery tendency in American national politics that was first manifested officially in 1850 with the Fugitive Slave Act. To understand a bit about this and about the state of slavery in America at the time, those of you who are not experts need to see a map of America. The United States of America are the red, the pink, and the gray. This is what was roughly called, we call the North, and or the free states where there was no slavery. And this is the South, or the slave states. And this is California. These now, the interesting area here is the green area, which we'll call the territories. The United States started here, then went there too, and then expanded in this direction, mainly eventually to cover all the green areas. But those were gradually assimilated. And according to the legislation, the American, until then, new territories that were becoming states could not become slaves. They had to be free. But then in 1854, there was, concerning the areas of Nebraska and Kansas here, there was a new law passed by the US Senate that said that it was up to those states to decide when they became states, whether they would be the territories, when they became states, slave or free. Now that was a huge upset in the trend of slavery downwards. After the early 19th century, no new laws could be, no new slaves could be imported in America, and no new slave states could be established. But this seemed to change that. And Lincoln, as a very concerned citizen, not as a politician, in October 1854, made a speech in a town in Illinois, Peoria, against the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Then, 3 years later, he had gone back into politics because of this issue and was very active in a newly formed party then called the Republican Party, which is the same Republican Party of today, but very different then, a very progressive organization, which was formed to resist this expansion, mostly because of this expansion of slavery. Until then, the two big parties were the Democratic, which was pro-slavery, and the Whig, or Liberal Party, of which Lincoln was an earlier member. Then, in 1857, he made a again famous talk, now famous, but then also publicized in Springfield, Illinois, against the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott is the gentleman on the right here, who was a slave in the South, but when his master traveled to the North, according to the laws of the North, the free states, he tried repeatedly to buy his freedom. But various local courts refused him, and when the matter went to the Supreme Court, Justice Taney on the right decreed in the Dred Scott decision that he was not entitled to the protection of the law and thus could not appeal to the court. Therefore, essentially it said that an African American did not have the rights of a real citizen of the United States. Lincoln was appointed by the Republican Party, chosen to represent them for the US Senate, and in June 1858, he made a speech called the House Divided Speech. He gave in this hall the State Senate of the state of Illinois. In the campaign for the Senate, he participated in 7 very well-known debates on which Professor Zarefsky has written a wonderful book, which were part of their campaign. They were given in various towns in Illinois between August and October 1858, and they attracted national interest. At those times, oratory, public oratory was very popular. People could listen for hours, sometimes many hours, to a speech, or even more hours a debate, and the whole text of those speeches or debates were published in newspapers and read with great interest. So this attracted national attention. Therefore, if Lincoln had died 6 months before being elected, in the summer of '60, the Republican Party would have lost a very good candidate for the presidential nomination. There were 4 or 5. Lincoln finally won, and the way he became very popular in the nucleus of the Republican Party in the East, the centers of power, was by a speech he gave at the Cooper Union in New York, invited there so that the Easterners, the more traditionally political people could meet this hick, as it were, this Midwesterner, these people whom they didn't know well. And there, Lincoln demonstrated a rather extreme, in a sense, and almost a sophistical thesis that according to the Constitution of the United States, there was a provision that slavery could not go in the territories. What is interesting here is that if you see the Kansas-Nebraska speech and the Dred Scott speech led to his winning the Republican nomination for senator, the House divided speech and the Lincoln-Douglas debate brought him into national prominence, led to the Cooper Union speech, which won him the Republican nomination for president. So in a very real way, Lincoln's advance was in the 50s due to his rhetoric. It was through his speeches that he became known, a virtual unknown, a provincial in national politics. Now, what changed from his term, his totally unremarkable first term in Congress, to 1850 that made this re-entry possible, transforming a good sort of small-time local politician and lawyer into a national level player? Well, first of all, at the national level, the organized reaction of to the pro-slavery tendency. This pro-slavery tendency started to mobilize people against slavery in the North, and one of the chief actions of this mobilization, of course, was the creation of the Republican Party. By the way, this is not Lincoln, the gentleman on the carriage. I just found that these two pictures fit together very beautifully. He's going from Springfield, Illinois to the White House. What had happened in the North, we must understand that in those times, most people in the North would not have seen this savage sight of a slave auction in the South. There were not many African Americans in the North. Some states as few as 2%, most usually 5% of the population. And so most Northerners would not have seen in their lifetime, especially in rural areas, an African American, let alone a slave. But then something happened in 1852. A very powerful book was written in the North, a novel, whose original title was The Man That Was a Thing. That's the title the author intended at first, but then we all know it today by the title it finally took, Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is perhaps, if one had to speak of the power of literature in human history, would find no better example. It was this book which sold an incredible 250,000 copies, second bestseller after the Bible in its first months. This is the second edition saying 2,000 copies already in the same year. It was this book which brought emotionally home to the North the issue of slavery. It made people understand what slavery was about emotionally, and that, of course, was the royal road to making it the big political issue. What the Lincoln-Douglas debates did, as David Zaretsky has written, was give voice to the latent moral concerns of the North, and yet, and that's most important, reconcile them with prevailing rules of history, legality, and race. Because until then, after Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote the book, it became a big emotional issue, but Lincoln, with these debates, helped people understand how they stood on that politically and why the issue mattered. Now, the other thing that happened, though, at the personal level, was Lincoln's rhetorical style. Lincoln's rhetorical style changed in the 50s, and if you wonder why, well, Euclid is part of the reason, amazingly, maybe amazingly to those who don't know it. But it was so important to Lincoln that in two autobiographical texts which he wrote that year, very short ones, he never wrote an autobiography. This is the one, that's all here. This is handwritten. And another little longer one, he does mention, the only book he mentions as an influence is Euclid's Elements. And he says that after his term in Congress, that is after 1850, he studied Euclid. I prefer from his autobiography the testament of a certain preacher, Mr. Gulliver, who writes in a book that he had a discussion after the Cooper Union address with Lincoln in New York and asked him where he learned to speak so convincingly and persuasively. And Lincoln said, in the course of my law reading, I constantly came upon the word demonstrate. I thought at first that I understood its meaning, but soon became satisfied that I did not. I said to myself, what do I do when I demonstrate more than when I reason or prove? How does demonstration differ from any other proof? I consulted all the books I could find, but with no results. You might as well have defined blue to a blind man. At last I said, Lincoln, you can never make a lawyer if you do not understand what demonstrate means. I went home to my father's house and stayed there till I could give any proposition in the 6 books of Euclid at sight. I then found out what demonstrate means and went back to my law studies. Okay? And demonstrate, as we know also from quod erat demonstrandum, QED, is the word that was used in the English translations of Euclid for proof. So what did Lincoln learn from Euclid? He doesn't tell us, except in a few statements like that, so we have to try and deduce it. And I will put an emphasis on what he learned that he could not learn from other places, because obviously some things he learned from his law practice, like break down an issue in parts or try and be precise at some points. But what can we deduce about what he learned from Euclid? We have to look separately at the pre-presidential speeches, the ones I refer to here mostly, and the presidential ones, because they are very different. The pre-presidential speeches are the speeches of an ambitious politician supporting his views and also demonstrating his rhetorical prowess, both at the same time. He wanted to demonstrate his views, and rhetoric, as we heard before, is very much about the purpose of the talk and the time, what Aristotle would call kairos to you, and are demonstrated, and also to demonstrate his rhetorical prowess. Lincoln wants to show what a good orator he is, and that is something that I think all good orators want to do. They are addressed to an audience of experts, and that's important. Most of them are inside the groups of the Republican Party supporters in Illinois or then in Cooper Union. They are addressed to aficionados of politics, to followers, to people who read and follow, experts. Most of them are, in a sense, adversarial, conceived of as responses to Stephen Douglas. Even in the talks that are not the debates, the presence of his opponent for the eventually for the US Senate in Illinois looms under them. He's talking against someone, and that gives the speeches a lot of their energy. They are long, some are 3-4 hours long, and especially the debates, probably a session, Professor Zarevsky would be, what, 8 hours maybe, 6-7 hours. And they are mostly addressed to the mind, logos, according to the Aristotelian distinction, not to the heart, not to pathos, not to pathos. So let's try and get some lessons out of them. Always begin from the necessary, I stress necessary definitions and principles. Lincoln determines the conceptual universe in which he will dwell within each speech. He does not rely on the other people having it. He establishes it, like Euclid does with his axioms, giving the definitions and principles, axioms, necessary to prove his point. His principles are self-evident. If you ask a philosopher what self-evident means, you'll have a problem. But I use it in the everyday sense that his audience would understand, either because they're obvious, again, a word that a mathematician would not accept, but Euclid thought his axioms were obvious, or derived from external authority, e.g. the Bible, a wise man. They are the axioms or principles best suited to his aim. That is most important. He doesn't go for the truth. He goes for the truth that he needs. I will give you an example of this that runs through all of his rhetoric, early rhetoric. As we know, on July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence of the United States was drafted and signed actually, and most of it was written by another great Euclidean, Thomas Jefferson, and we see the influence. Thomas Jefferson, unlike Lincoln, knew very good Greek and read Euclid in the original, also for enjoyment in his retirement. He read Thucydides and Euclid in Greek for enjoyment. So we see the trace here that we hold these truths to be self-evident, an axiom, that all men are created equal. Lincoln needs that for his rhetoric. The problem is that that principle in this form is not mentioned in the United States Constitution, which came 11 years later, and which is the basic document of the American Republic. Lincoln doesn't like that, so because it's not there. So he does not refer to the Constitution, very rarely. He forgets it, except the Cooper Union address. And because he wants his little principle, his great principle, but I call it that way as a joke, he goes back to the Declaration of Independence and mostly forgets about the Constitution as the founding document of America, which was not what it was considered at that time. So he will have his principle. So he chose what he wanted. Lesson 2, Lincoln chooses suitable targets for demonstration. The obvious, any of you who know anything about Euclid, who have perhaps read a proof of Euclidean theorem in Euclid's way, know that Euclid uses axiom, already proven statements, and some operations he does with compasses and rulers and so on to prove a new truth. That is the visible method with logical deduction. There's an invisible one, which to understand you have to see how the books, the chapters hang together, how the various theorems follow one another, which is that each time he proves exactly what he is ready for. The architecture of the books is such that there is a supporting structure and theorems appear to us almost magically out of nowhere, but they are really very well prepared. In the same way, Lincoln follows this invisible method. Lincoln does not so much prove in these speeches the statements he believes in, but sets as his belief statements he can prove according to pre-established principles and facts which he chooses. A great example of that is the House Divided speech. I will have two examples for it so we understand a bit about it. Being the first speech in his campaign, it's very important for the Senate. It sets his main agenda, the anti-slavery position of the Republican Party. Anti-slavery is the central issue of the Republican Party. However, whatever we may think of now at the time of those nice Republicans being anti-slavery, some of them were not anti-slavery for moral, religious, humanitarian, or other reasons. They were against it for practical. For example, poor people couldn't own slaves. So they didn't want the rich people to own slaves and have cheaper labor power than their own. Or there were many other reasons. So if you went against slavery as a central issue, there would be a problem because many middle-of-the-road voters were not ready to accept a general condemnation. Secondly, the anti-slavery camp is made up of people with different, often very contradictory reasons. Some were moral, some religious, some opportunistic, some very selfish reasons for opposing it. And also, most importantly, don't forget that the United States is the United States. People believed very much in states' rights. And since each state until then could determine whether it wanted to be a free or a slave state, it was not at all obvious that this was an issue for a national party and therefore would be a part of the campaign for the US Senate. So what does Lincoln, the sly Euclidean fox, do? He changes the main issue from the expected slavery is bad for the country to another. It is bad for the country to be divided about slavery. This is really his invention. Obviously, it's bad. But he decides to make it the issue of his central speech, the first speech for the Senate. He declares at the very start of the speech his basic principle. It's almost like a heading. It's the first line of the speech, the first words. A house divided upon itself cannot stand, from the Gospel of St. Mark. And in reference to his first question, he sets his principle, and in the rest of the speech, he does say a few things about whether slavery is good or bad, but those are marginal. The essence is we cannot be divided. The nation cannot survive, as he puts it, half state, half slave, and half free. Now, this is for him something he can argue about. Lincoln, as an experienced public speaker, is very well aware that he cannot present complex and precise Euclidean demonstrations in the context of a public political speech. He cannot get up here to 1,000 people in a hall and start proving a complex Euclid logical proof. So he adapts the technique to what he can do, and in order to do this, he takes into account something very, very central that you can miss if you don't know too much about Euclid. Each Euclidean theorem proves its geometric truths at two levels. the general one, the structure of the theorem, which is beginning, middle, end. The beginning is the statement of the problem, the end, the repetition of the statement. The middle is the proof itself, which also involves often breakdown, if it's a complex theorem, into various things to be proven, which are proven at the micro level through the appropriate ordering of axioms, previously proven truths, as well as geometrical operations by certain standard formal patterns that create persuasion. Euclid uses 3 or 4 methods of putting his sentences together so they become convincing, because do not forget that the mathematical theorem is a form of proof, a proof to expert listeners, mathematicians, that a certain geometric truth is correct. So Lincoln creates a visible macrostructure in every speech and often returns to it. In a Euclidean theorem, the macrostructure is given, but readers of a Euclidean theorems are experts and know the macrostructure beforehand from being used to reading many theorems. You cannot assume that sophistication in the public speech. So in order for them not to get lost in the minute deductions, you have to give them and remind them throughout the speech of a macrostructure. Again, I return to the House divided speech. To support his thesis that extending slavery to the territories will break the nation apart, Lincoln has to say many things to his audience. Remind them of the Dred Scott and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Show them that they are part of a more general plan of extending slavery. Connect them with his opponent. Propose that only voting for the party, and for him, of course, is the way for Illinois citizens to counter that. There's very different things he has to do. So how does he begin? Does he tell us anything about the issue? No. His first statement is, if we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we would better judge what to do and how to do it. So he gives us a totally abstract, our friend earlier said about logic that it is devoid of content. It's really devoid of content. It could be applied to anything. And this is a leader. This is the macrostructure on which he builds the speech, addressing each one of these whither, where, and so on in turn. And of course, some modern Euclideans would do this in a PowerPoint presentation where they show you the general diagram at first and then remind you at every point where we are. Of course, you'd call this logical, but the technique is largely Euclidean. And of course, I have too high an opinion of your intelligence and sophistication to have such a diagram in my PowerPoint. The fourth lesson and last we'll deal with of the basic ones is that Lincoln knows better than doing logical deduction in big schemes. He does it only at the micro level. When he persuades about little things, when he focuses on something, he uses the Euclidean patterns, which work almost magically. He has such a mastery of them that even when he's not saying something very logical, by putting the non-logically perfect connections in the template of a Euclidean proof, he makes them convincing almost musically in a way that would remind the bad reasons, perhaps might provoke Plato's objections that he is using rhetoric as a form of enchantment, because as we know from Gorgias' Encomium to Helen, magic and rhetoric, the magic of words, are very close. So he creates very persuasive patterns, which nevertheless he has learned from Euclid. Now, we are very lucky. You know, studying Lincoln and Euclid is like doing twin studies, where psychologists they take two twins genetically same but separated at birth to see what is the same to them because they have grown up so differently. Lincoln did not know Greek, did not know Latin, and he did not study, except one collection of speeches, good writing when he was little. He did not study rhetorical manuals. He did not study Cicero or Quintilian or Aristotle. He studied Euclid. So what he got was from there. And there are two basic such patterns in Euclid. Please don't look at the content. It's not important. This is from I think the fourth theorem of the first book. The one is Kiasmos. Look at this part here. The most famous modern Kiasmos, you all know, it's from another great American president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Country, you, country. A, B, B, A. Okay? Like an X. So, in fact, AC is not equal to B. For the angle would have to be equal to ACB, but it is not equal to ACB. Thus, AC is not equal to AB. All that is in the theorem. A, B, B, A. In a chiasmus, the repetitions are either of the same thing or of the opposite thing. And a more complex, and when I say complex chiasmus, I say extended in the sense that we have a chiasmal structure here and two chiasmoses inside it. Here we also have ring composition. Ring composition is composed according to the same principle, only in the center we have a part standing out. It is a previous truth or an important common notion, an axiom. So here we have AL and BC, and inside a principle that connects them. These are the patterns that Euclid uses all the time. Here, you don't have to look at this. This is the first theorem of the first book in simpler truths. The whole theorem is an extended ring composition. And if you want to study these formal patterns, there's a lot of bibliography, and the basic ideas you can go on my website, just Google my name, and there are 3 or 4 papers. One of them is called Sing Muse of the Hypotenuse. I give it to you. Again, it's a rhetorical trick because it's kind of silly, funny title. You can remember it more easily. Sing Muse of the Hypotenuse. Now, let us look very, very briefly at how we can detect such patterns. If you want to detect patterns, you find parts of a proof or of a speech that have some connection, where you have a paragraph which seems to prove something in itself separately from others. And you tend to look, if you have that habit. Now, if it becomes a habit, you can understand, realize them, find them out without thinking too much. But if you don't have the habit, look at the center or look at repetitions. Okay, so here if we look at the center, in the house-divided speech, the house-divided speech against itself cannot stand is repeated randomly almost. If you extend the structure, here's the declared principle, which he has given as axiom at the beginning of the speech, and you can see that, in a sense, he intensifies the problem to here. This comes out, stands almost in itself. There's no reason, no logical reason why it's there. And then, one point by point, he returns to reach the opposite conclusion of what is here, that the pro-slavery people give us a solution, they don't. The solution is different, because the way they are pushing us, we will be all slave or all free. Another example is in the Dred Scott decision. Look at this amazing repetition. The exact same long period is repeated. Why would anyone do that? Why would someone, repeat the exact proposition 2 times in a paragraph? Same words exactly. If you break it down, you see in the middle there's a fact. Judge Douglas cannot know something about the way the voting goes in the territory. It's a technical fact. Then here we have exact repetition. Those who are registered, those who are registered. Then we have this sentence, which is again fully repeated. And this is the result. You have exactly this kind of ring composition. So, to recap, Euclidean influences in Lincoln's pre-presidential speeches, Lincoln always works at both the macro and micro levels, macro and micro, and establishes the micro, always begins from first principles, uses Euclid to create in the speeches a sense, I stress this, of fully logical demonstration. Yet because of the context in which his speeches are said, politics, oral communication, the toil and rubble of a big crowd, they are not always fully logical in the traditional way. We could rephrase this. Lincoln uses Euclid not to prove always fully logical truths in the sense a mathematician or philosopher might define them, but to make his arguments more persuasive. In other words, they are tools in his toolbox to become a more persuasive speaker. We shall end much more briefly with the presidential speeches, which are very different. For the pre-presidential to become presidential, we need, of course, elections. So this is a result of the 1860 elections by county. You know, it is an extremely interesting result. Obviously, there are 4 candidates: Lincoln, Douglas, Bell, and Breckinridge. And as you can see, the South votes totally differently from the North. What is interesting to us particularly here is that the North, red is where Lincoln is stronger, blue where Douglas is stronger. You see, again, except isolated islands here in the South, Douglas only gets votes in the North. And that shows us that Douglas, in a sense, is not so far from Lincoln in accepting the South. Lincoln could not argue with the Southerners. The Southerners wanted their slaves, period. Douglas was discussing whether it is good to extend slavery or not and under what conditions. So there is a rhetorical lesson here, yet often cannot, you've seen it in politics all the time, especially this time in Greece. We see it every night, those of us, or of you, I would say, I don't have that vice, who watch television and the news, that you have strong adversarial, so-called adversarial oppositions of two politicians, and they are really not talking to one another. They are parallel monologues. So he could not have a debate with those guys. His debates was with the guy he beat in his own territory. Still, the northern votes were enough because it was much more densely populated to win him the presidency. And this is his first inauguration. Interesting historical fact here, the judge of the Supreme Court holding the Bible where Lincoln takes oath is Judge Taney, the guy who ruled on the Dred Scott affair. The presidential speeches are very different. They are delivered by a leader of a country engaged in a bloody civil war. Again, rhetoric, always remember who speaks, what his, at what time, what kairos, to whom and why. They are, unlike the others, they are addressed to the whole nation, not to experts. They are addressed to all citizens, civilians, soldiers, families, men, women, children, everyone. At first, mostly of the North, but then gradually, you sense that Lincoln is addressing the whole nation. Their aim is not to demonstrate. There is nothing to demonstrate. People are fighting out there. It is to comfort and to unify the nation. They are all very short speeches. People don't have time for 2, 3, 4-hour speeches when there's a war being fought. They're of a few minutes. And unlike the pre-presidential speeches, which are all logos, these are almost all pathos, all pathos. They're addressed to the heart. The greatest of them all, by the way, the first time I saw this mentioned in Europe is in a book published in 1913 called Modern Parliamentary Eloquence by Lord Curzon in England, the great parliamentarian, who rules that the Gettysburg Address is the greatest political speech ever created, ever given. In the end of the 19th century, this was also, it was very famous in America. If you go to Washington, to the very impressive temple, to the Professor Zarefsky spoke before about the role of rhetoric in commemoration, in rituals, in creating almost something sacred. Here we have complete case of rhetoric in architecture. This is the temple to Lincoln, and it is a huge statue of, I don't know how, 10 meters more maybe, taller, of Lincoln sitting there as the great-grandfather, patriarch of the nation, old Abraham, old Abe. And on his side is engraved in stone, as it were, the Gettysburg Address. Small interest. By the way, it was the first time I learned of it existed and saw it as a fairly young man, as a student visiting Washington, because American friends may be surprised by the fact that it's not really well known outside America. And certainly does not have the iconic structure. Now, why was the Gettysburg Address given? I'll take a very short respite by doing some audiovisual rhetoric here. So the war begins. In 1861, a very bloody war, huge battles. In the summer, in July of 1863, we have the Battle of Gettysburg, 50,000 casualties, including dead, wounded, and missing in 3 days. Thousands of dead on the field. And then, in November of that year, there is a new cemetery, a military cemetery for the northern dead, about 3,500, 3,000 and a half, built outside the town of Gettysburg. In November 1863, Lincoln goes there. These photographs are from that day to inaugurate, to consecrate the new cemetery. And at some point, the people who go there gather around this little hill where the central speaker will address the crowds. Interestingly, the central speaker is a gentleman called Everett, who speaks for 3.5 hours. It's not Lincoln. Afterwards, it's been said that Lincoln will address also the crowds, the president who is there to honor this event. Interestingly, his speech is so short that the photographer does not have time to photograph him speaking and just catches him as he's going down from the mound. This is Lincoln here without his hat because of the occasion. This is him coming down after the speech. It was a minute, a little over a minute, less than 2 minutes. And once we'll hear it, and then I'll show you a small structure with a beautiful voice of Jeff Daniels. So I have the text for you, for those who don't know it, and a very emotional reading, which I'm not sure is the right one, but it's very interesting in that it works so well.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Now, this is our Greek ancestors would call this epidictic or exhibition rhetoric, the kind spoken at the great occasion. It doesn't aim to convince. It has been analyzed in hundreds or maybe thousands of papers and very good books as prophecy, as preaching, as classical rhetoric. It's much more classical, much more Ciceronian. It uses many figures of classical rhetoric that previous speeches by Lincoln don't, like triads, for example. Of the people, for the people, by the people, of the people, for the people, and so on, or hallow, consecrate, dedicate, as poetry, and it is very poetic, especially the way Jeff Daniels reads it, as propaganda, as ideology of nation building, all the things that Professor Zarevsky mentioned that are being studied today, and it is undoubtedly all of those things. So where's Euclid? The Euclidean lessons of the pre-presidential speeches seem at first glance not to have survived here. Here it's short, it's emotional, there's nothing to prove. Yet something alerts us to look more closely. The basic principle of the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, is no more taken to be a self-evident truth. All previous speeches by Lincoln begin taking that as self-evident. But here, in the first sense, Lincoln says it is a proposition, the term used in English for a theorem in translations of Euclid of that time. And believe you me, Lincoln knows very well the difference between an axiom and a proposition. He calls it here a proposition. Why is that? In the start of the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln declared that this basic principle is now being tested. He says, a great war testing whether a nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. With this in mind, the speech can be read as the defense of a principle that has been challenged. It's not self-evident anymore, and now needs to be demonstrated. The address uses the occasion of honoring the dead as an opportunity to tell the living that the founding principle of the country must be demonstrated, tested, and thus re-established now through action, since it's no more self-evident. The whole is given unity by an invisible Euclidean pattern of exactly the same type that great Euclidean patterns appear. Now, how do we find that? Well, you remember the trick. Look either at the middle or repetitions. If you look at the middle, the brave men, living and dead, who struggle here can concentrated it above our power to add or detract. The world will little note, no longer remember what we say here. That's a very ironic statement in context, by the way. Probably they remember it more than the battle. But it can never forget what they did here. This is pure Kiasmos. Look at it. The brave men read, the men, what they did here. The men who struggled, read. Blue, blue is us speaking. So when I see a pure Kiasmos in the middle of a speech, I expand outwards and look for the supporting structure. You will allow me, after the beautiful reading of the Gettysburg Address, to read it to you. Please try not to look at the very little funny patterns until the middle. And I don't obviously read as beautifully as Jeff Daniels, but I will try and stay a bit closer to what I think the meaning is, and you will see the pattern soon. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of the war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who gave their lives that their nation might live. It's altogether fitting and proper that we do that. Yet, in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate it, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our power to add or detract. The world will little note, no longer remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, rather, the living, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause to which they gave their last full measure of devotion. But that we here highly resolve that this dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall now have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. The continent becomes the earth. The local issue becomes global. And like a good practitioner or a devout practitioner of ring composition, I will end with my final picture and say, yes, that even in a very emotional speech on the blood-stained and honored battleground of Gettysburg, Euclid and Abraham Lincoln can do the magic of their geometry. Thank you.